Picture this, a sweltering August afternoon in 1944, somewhere in rural Iowa. The smell of fried dough hangs heavy in the air. A Ferris wheel creaks against a cloudless sky. Children scream with delight on the tilt-a-whirl. A brass band murders a Sousa march near the livestock pavilion. It's a county fair, pure Americana, the kind of scene Norman Rockwell would paint if he'd been there with a brush and too much time. Now add something that doesn't belong. 3 men in faded grey uniforms, walking slowly through the midway. Their postures are rigid, military, out of sync with the easy chaos around them. Their faces, weathered, aristocratic, are frozen in something between confusion and disbelief. They're flanked by 2 American soldiers, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, chewing gum, relaxed. One of the soldiers waves to a girl selling lemonade. She waves back. The men in grey don't wave. They don't speak. They just stare. These are not farm workers. These are not common soldiers. These are generals, German generals, men who once commanded entire divisions across the Eastern Front, who planned operations that reshaped borders, who dined with the Reich's highest echelons. And now, here they are, standing beside a prize-winning Holstein cow, watching a pie-eating contest, absolutely unable to process what they're seeing. In their world, prisoners of war were livestock. Caged, starved, worked until their bones showed through their skin. The concept of humane treatment was a punchline, a weakness exploited by those too soft to win wars. Yet here they stood, clean, fed, escorted like tourists through the American heartland, surrounded by people who weren't afraid of them. Weren't angry at them. Weren't even particularly interested in them. The dissonance was suffocating. One of the generals, a man who'd once overseen the siege of a Soviet city, watched a child drop his cotton candy and immediately receive another from his mother without punishment, without hesitation. The general's jaw tightened. Something inside him cracked, just a little. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. But it was. And that was the problem. To understand the shock, you have to understand who these men were before the transport ships, before the barbed wire, before Iowa. They were Prussian aristocracy wrapped in Wehrmacht grey. Sons of Junker estates and military academies where discipline wasn't taught, it was forged into your spine before you could read. Men whose grandfathers had served under Bismarck, whose fathers had bled in the trenches of the Great War. For them, the military wasn't a career. It was identity. Bloodline. Destiny. They had been raised on a very specific gospel: strength respects only strength. Mercy is weakness. The enemy, once captured, deserves nothing but the bare minimum required by international law, and even that was negotiable when no one was watching. After all, war wasn't a gentleman's game. It was existential. Darwinian. The strong devoured the weak, and sentiment was a luxury reserved for peacetime philosophers. When these generals imagined their own capture, and they did, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the front was collapsing and the Allies were closing in, they imagined cages. Interrogations under harsh lights. Cold rations, if any. Humiliation designed to break the spirit before the body. They imagined being treated exactly as they had treated Soviet officers captured on the Eastern Front, with cold efficiency, minimal resources, and the unspoken understanding that a prisoner's life held no value beyond information extraction. They prepared themselves for degradation. For rage. For the kind of primal hatred that fuels revenge. What they didn't prepare for was courtesy. This mental framework, this iron certainty about how the world operated, was their armor. It insulated them from doubt. From guilt. From the uncomfortable questions that arise when you've spent years executing orders that history would later call monstrous. If the enemy was barbaric, then your own brutality was justified. If war was hell, then hellish behavior was merely professionalism. But that armor had a weakness: it was built on assumptions. And assumptions, as it turns out, shatter quite easily when a 19-year-old American farm boy from Nebraska offers you a Coca-Cola and asks, in broken German, if you've ever seen a genuine John Deere tractor up close. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These weren't the decadent weaklings Goebbels had promised them. These weren't the mongrel masses of a dying empire. These were normal people. Friendly, even. Industrious. Confident in a way that didn't require cruelty to assert itself. And that realization, that slow, creeping, undeniable realization, was more terrifying than any interrogation room could ever be. Because it meant that everything they believed about the moral architecture of the war might be wrong. And if that was wrong, what else was? The Atlantic crossing had been disorienting enough. Packed into the hold of a transport ship, surrounded by men who'd gone from warriors to cargo in the span of a signature on surrender documents. But arrival was something else entirely. They expected urban detention centers. Concrete and chain link in the shadows of industrial cities, where the machinery of American war production would grind day and night as a reminder of their defeat. Instead, the trains carried them inland. Past cities, yes, but then beyond them. Into the American interior. Into landscapes so vast and empty they seemed like fiction. The camps themselves were surreal. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows across former farmland. Fences, yes, but not the electrified death traps of Auschwitz or the freezing mud pits of the Eastern Front. These were orderly. Clean. Almost quaint. Inside, bunks with actual mattresses. Latrines that functioned. Mess halls that served 3 meals a day, meals with protein, with vegetables, with portions that didn't require you to fight your neighbor for scraps. The first time a general was handed a Red Cross inspection report to sign, he read it 3 times, convinced it was propaganda. But the food kept coming. The doctors kept making rounds. The International Committee kept showing up with clipboards and translators, documenting conditions that were, by any objective measure, humane. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't mercy in the emotional sense. This was American pragmatism operating at industrial scale. The logic was cold and clear: treat German POWs well, document that treatment meticulously, and broadcast it through every available channel. Why? Because American boys were being held in Stalag Luft camps and Japanese prison cells. Because reciprocity, even the hope of reciprocity, might keep those boys alive a little longer. The U.S. War Department had calculated that systematic decency was a strategic asset. Cruelty was a luxury they couldn't afford. So the machine didn't run on hatred. It ran on logistics. Generals who'd commanded men through 3 winters on the Eastern Front found themselves assigned to work details picking cotton in Texas, harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, cutting timber in the Pacific Northwest. Not as punishment, as employment. They were paid. Actual wages, credited to accounts they could access after repatriation. The absurdity of it was staggering. You lose a war, surrender your army, and your captors put you on payroll? But there was something else happening beneath the surface. Something the generals wouldn't recognize for months. The Americans weren't just housing them. They were studying them. Psychologists embedded in camp administration, quietly taking notes. Educators designing courses in democratic civics. Intelligence officers monitoring conversations, identifying which prisoners were hardcore Nazis and which were disillusioned Wehrmacht professionals who might, with the right exposure, begin to question everything the Reich had taught them. The camps were laboratories. Not for torture, for transformation. And the most dangerous experiments don't happen in dungeons. They happen over dinner conversations. Over baseball games. Over permission slips to attend a county fair on a Saturday afternoon, just to see what happens when you let a man who once ordered artillery strikes on civilian targets watch a teenager win a stuffed bear at a ring toss booth. The U.S. War Department had a problem that didn't involve bullets. By 1944, they were holding over 370,000 German POWs on American soil, an entire nation's worth of defeated soldiers, scattered across 500 camps from coast to coast. Feeding them was manageable. Housing them was logistics. But the question that kept strategic planners awake at night was simpler and more dangerous: what happens when we send them back? Because Germany wasn't going to vanish. The war would end. The borders would be redrawn. But the people, the millions of people who'd been raised under Nazi ideology, who'd fought for the Reich, who'd internalized 12 years of propaganda about racial destiny and Lebensraum, those people would still be there. And if they returned home as martyrs, as unrepentant believers in a cause that simply lost due to bad luck or betrayal, then the peace would be a slow-burning fuse toward the next catastrophe. So the United States did something radical. They decided to change minds. Not through torture. Not through forced indoctrination or the kind of re-education camps that would later define Soviet policy. No, the American method was softer, stranger, and far more insidious. They called it intellectual diversion. Others called it psychological warfare by hospitality. Inside the camps, programs began appearing that had nothing to do with detention. Libraries stocked with American newspapers, uncensored reports on Allied victories, yes, but also stories about labor disputes, political scandals, the messy reality of democratic governance. Debate clubs were organized where prisoners could argue politics without fear of punishment. Educational courses in everything from English literature to mechanical engineering. Music programs, orchestras, jazz bands, even opera performances. The goal wasn't to make them love America. The goal was to make them think. Some generals resisted. They saw it as corruption, a deliberate attempt to weaken their resolve through comfort and distraction. They were right, of course, but they underestimated how effective comfort could be as a weapon. Because propaganda works best when people are desperate, hungry, looking for someone to blame. It works less well when you're sitting in a reasonably comfortable chair, with a full stomach, reading a newspaper that openly criticizes its own government, and nobody punishes you for noticing the contradiction between what you were told about America and what you're actually experiencing. The most dangerous moment for any ideology isn't persecution, it's doubt. And doubt grows best in the gap between expectation and reality. So when prisoners were selected for cultural excursions, field trips, essentially chaperoned visits to nearby towns, it wasn't generosity. It was strategy. Let them see American factories still running at full capacity. Let them see farms with more tractors than workers. Let them see towns where nobody seemed afraid, nobody seemed starving, nobody seemed to care that the war was happening at all. Let them see a superpower that could fight a global war and still have county fairs on the weekends. The request arrived on a county administrator's desk somewhere in rural Wisconsin, typed on official letterhead, request for temporary POW labor detail, harvest assistance, infrastructure repair, general agriculture. It was 1944. American men were overseas. Farms were understaffed. The Victory Garden campaigns could only stretch so far. Meanwhile, there were camps full of able-bodied German soldiers sitting idle. The economics were obvious. But economics weren't the only factor. There was something else, something that wouldn't appear in official reports but hummed beneath every decision made at the local level. Curiosity. People wanted to see the enemy. Not as propaganda monsters or distant threats, but as actual human beings. And so the requests started coming. Could a work detail help with the harvest? Could a supervised group attend the town's weekend festival? Could a few of the higher-ranking prisoners, officers, even generals, be escorted to the county fair as a gesture of goodwill and, frankly, as a spectacle? The military command approved it. Carefully. Selectively. With armed escorts and strict protocols. But they approved it. And so began one of the strangest chapters of the American home front. German POWs, including high-ranking officers, walking through small-town America like surreal tourists, flanked by young GIs who looked less like guards and more like bored chaperones. The first fair visit was almost certainly awkward. Imagine the scene: a German general, a man who'd once reviewed panzer formations, who'd signed orders that sent thousands into battle, now standing beside a livestock pen, watching a 4-H kid brush a sheep. The kid looks up, sees the grey uniform, sees the guard, and shrugs. Goes back to brushing. No fear. No anger. Just indifference. The generals walked past game booths where teenagers threw baseballs at stacked bottles. Past vendors selling caramel apples and roasted corn. Past tractor displays showcasing the latest John Deere models, machines that, the generals couldn't help but notice, were larger and more advanced than anything they'd seen on German farms. Past women in summer dresses laughing at some private joke, completely unbothered by the presence of enemy officers 10 feet away. It was humiliating. Not in the way violence is humiliating, but in the way being irrelevant is humiliating. Because the message, unspoken but impossible to miss, was clear: you're not a threat. You're barely even interesting. One general later recounted watching a Ferris wheel operator, an older man with a limp, probably a veteran of the First War, glance at him, nod politely, and then go back to pulling the lever that sent kids spinning into the sky. No hatred. No reverence. Just the civil acknowledgement you'd give any stranger. This was the American flex. Not military might, though that was everywhere, implicit in the factories and the logistics and the sheer abundance of everything. No, this was something more profound, the ability to wage total war on 3 continents and still maintain normalcy at home. The ability to be so secure, so industrially dominant, so utterly confident in victory, that you could let enemy generals eat funnel cake under light guard and not worry for a second that it made you look weak. Because it didn't. It made you look invincible. The generals understood this, even if they couldn't articulate it. They'd been told America was a nation of soft, decadent individualists who'd collapse under pressure. Instead, they were watching a nation so strong it didn't need to perform strength. It just was. And that realization was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. There's a kind of psychological breaking point that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with drama or revelation. It seeps in slowly, through 1,000 tiny contradictions, until one morning you wake up and realize you no longer believe the things you thought were foundational truths. For the German generals, that collapse happened in stages. First came disbelief. This had to be theater, a propaganda show designed to soften them for interrogation. The good treatment, the libraries, the debate clubs, the field trips, it was all too calculated, too deliberate. Surely the mask would slip. Surely the real America, the one Goebbels had described, would reveal itself. But it never did. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Because everything they'd been told about America, that it was culturally bankrupt, racially chaotic, industrially inferior, morally weak, was being disproven by direct experience. Not through lectures or propaganda, but through the simple, grinding reality of living inside a system that functioned better than their own. The food alone was a mindfuck. These were supposed to be the dregs, rations for prisoners, the bottom of the supply chain. Yet they were eating better than many German civilians had eaten during peacetime. White bread. Real butter. Meat that wasn't extruded from God knows what. Cigarettes. Coffee. The abundance was casual, almost wasteful. One general watched an American guard throw away half a sandwich and nearly wept. But the food was just a symbol. The real weapon was respect. Not friendship, respect. The guards weren't cruel. They weren't particularly warm, either. They were professional. They followed protocols. They enforced rules without sadism. When a prisoner had a legitimate complaint, there was a process to address it. When someone got sick, a doctor appeared. When the Red Cross showed up, the Americans welcomed them, confident that inspection would reveal nothing incriminating. This was humiliating in a way that torture never could be. Because torture, you can resist. You can tell yourself you're enduring, that your suffering proves your strength, that you're the victim and they're the monsters. But how do you resist decency? How do you maintain your hatred for an enemy who treats you better than your own country treated the people you conquered? The generals began avoiding each other's eyes during meals. They stopped discussing ideology. The younger officers, the true believers, the ones who'd grown up singing Horst Wessel Lied in the Hitler Youth, started asking dangerous questions. If America was weak, why had it crushed the Wehrmacht so efficiently? If democracy was chaos, why did everything here run like clockwork? If racial purity was strength, why were the mongrel Americans outproducing the Reich 10-1? And the answer, the terrible, unavoidable answer, was that everything they believed was a lie. Not a well-intentioned mistake. Not a tragic miscalculation. A lie? A deliberate, systematic lie designed to justify atrocities and exploitation and conquest, sold to an entire generation as destiny. The breaking point wasn't marked by any single event. But it happened. You could see it in the way men stopped saluting each other with the old stiff precision. In the way conversation shifted from politics to crops, from strategy to baseball. In the way someone would mention going home and another would quietly say, "To what?" The war had ended. But for many of these men, the real defeat was just beginning. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The camps erupted in confusion, celebration from some, despair from others, mostly just exhausted uncertainty. The war was over. Now came the harder question: what next? Repatriation began in 1946, a slow bureaucratic process of screening, paperwork, and transport ships heading back across the Atlantic. The generals who'd spent months or years in American captivity boarded those ships with mixed feelings. Relief at going home, yes. But also dread. Because they knew what waited for them. The letters had been sporadic, heavily censored, but the shape of the truth had seeped through. Germany wasn't just defeated, it was destroyed. Cities reduced to rubble. Infrastructure shattered. Millions dead, millions more displaced. The economy was ash. The government was dissolved. The rye that had promised 1,000 years had lasted 12, and those 12 had ended in apocalypse. When they arrived, the contrast was incomprehensible. One general, returning to what had been a mid-sized Bavarian town, found it erased. Not damaged, erased. The street grid was still there, but the buildings were gone. Just ruins and rubble and people living in basements. Children with hollow eyes. Old women selling family heirlooms for bread. The smell of death and lime and desperation. And in his mind, unwanted and intrusive, the memory of a county fair in Iowa. The Ferris wheel. The laughter. The casual, wasteful abundance. The sheer normalcy of a nation that had fought the same war he had, but had somehow emerged untouched. Stronger, even. The guilt was complex. Not just guilt for losing, guilt for having believed. For having participated. For having looked at maps and drawn lines and signed orders without ever truly understanding what those orders meant in human terms. The Americans had held a mirror up to him, not through accusation, but through indifference and decency. And now, standing in the ruins of his homeland, he couldn't unsee what that mirror had shown him. Many of the repatriated officers spoke openly about this in later years. Interviews, memoirs, testimony at denazification hearings. They described the psychological defeat as more total than the military one. They described learning that true power wasn't brutality, it was the capacity for mercy. That true strength wasn't domination, it was confidence so absolute you didn't need to perform it. One general, asked when he knew Germany had truly lost the war, didn't mention Stalingrad or Normandy or Berlin. He mentioned a county fair. The smell of fried dough. And an American teenager who'd offered him a Coca-Cola without a trace of fear. There's a lesson buried in this strange, almost absurd chapter of history. A lesson that transcends the specific details of POW camps and county fairs and German generals standing bewildered beside prize-winning livestock. It's a lesson about power. Real power. Not the theatrical kind that parades through capital cities or broadcasts itself through propaganda. But the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it's so foundational, so absolute, that it can afford to be casual. The United States in 1944 was prosecuting the largest military conflict in human history. It was fighting on multiple continents simultaneously. It was feeding allies, producing equipment at scales that defied comprehension, coordinating logistics chains that spanned oceans. And in the middle of all that, it had the capacity, the surplus resources, the sheer industrial and organizational excess, to treat enemy prisoners not just humanely, but with a level of care that often exceeded what those men's own country had provided them. That wasn't weakness. That was a flex so profound it bordered on arrogance. The German generals understood this, eventually. They understood that being allowed to attend a town fair wasn't mercy, it was a demonstration. A message delivered without words: we are so far beyond you that we can afford to be kind. We can fight you with one hand and maintain civilian normalcy with the other. We don't need to brutalize you to prove our strength because our strength is self-evident. History remembers the battles, the strategies, the turning points and the treaties. But power, the kind that shapes the long arc of civilization, doesn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it announces itself with a Ferris wheel spinning against a summer sky, the smell of popcorn drifting on the wind, and an enemy general standing in stunned silence, realizing that the war was never close. Not even remotely. And that was the most devastating victory of all.